And be honest with you, when all this dust settles, the game of golf is going to be better off.
The 2025 Ryder Cup at Bethpage Black is shaping up to be one of the most intense competitions in the tournament's history, and Greg Norman has some strong opinions about why Team USA might struggle, despite playing at home. According to Norman, the American team has fundamental problems that go way deeper than just picking the right players or having the crowd on their side. He thinks they suck at building real team chemistry, and honestly, his reasoning is pretty brutal when you look at the details. Norman recently wrapped up his time as CEO of LIV Golf, but his connection to the Ryder Cup goes back further than most people realize. Back in 2021, he attended the Ryder Cup at Whistling Straits while he was secretly planning what would become LIV Golf. They called it Project X back then. He watched the American team win on home soil with massive crowds chanting USA over and over, and something clicked in his mind. Norman saw all this passion and team spirit happening for just one weekend, and he realized that professional golf had absolutely nothing like this the rest of the year. The players would go back to competing as individuals, and all that team energy just disappeared. This observation became the foundation for why he created LIV Golf with its team format and guaranteed contracts. So in a weird way, the Ryder Cup itself inspired the biggest disruption professional golf has ever seen. But here's where Norman gets really critical of the American side. He noticed something crucial at Whistling Straits that separated the US team from the European team. The American players built their team connections based on temporary stuff like where they went to college or which practice pods they were assigned to for that specific week. Norman saw this as creating a fake team identity that only existed because of patriotic hype and home crowd energy. It was all manufactured for the event, rather than being real and organic. Meanwhile, he looked at the European players and saw something completely different. They represented the tour they actually grew up on together. They came up through the DP World Tour playing against each other and supporting each other for years. That shared history created a powerful team concept that didn't need to be invented just for Ryder Cup week. According to Norman, this fundamental difference explains why Europe has been so dominant in recent years. The Europeans have genuine institutional identity, while the Americans are basically faking it with college pride and temporary groupings. Before we go further, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us what you think matters more in team sports. Is it financial incentive like LIV Golf offers? Or is it national pride and shared history like the European team has? We want to hear your take on this, because it's going to be huge at Bethpage Black. The money situation makes everything even more complicated. Norman points out that American players have caused controversy by demanding payment to play in the Ryder Cup. Patrick Cantlay and others have openly talked about wanting compensation for participating in the tournament. This stands in complete contrast to the European approach, where players traditionally view it as an honor to represent their team and their tour. The Europeans even contribute financially back to their tour through Ryder Cup participation. Norman sees this as proof that American professional golf has a serious problem with institutional respect. When players care more about getting paid than representing their country, it shows a transactional relationship with the game. The irony here is thick because Norman's LIV Golf model threw massive guaranteed contracts at players to buy their loyalty. LIV tried to purchase the team concept that traditional tours couldn't build naturally. Norman was essentially saying that if you can't create real loyalty, just pay for it instead. Norman also tears into modern players for lacking the technical consistency and professional rigor that his generation had. This criticism gets personal when he talks about equipment management. Back in his playing days, Norman hand-made his own equipment. He assembled his own shafts and weighed his grips to make sure everything was absolutely consistent. He knew his club so well that he could instantly tell if something was even slightly off based on ball flight or divot patterns. He holds modern professionals to the same standard, and he thinks most of them fall way short. The example that blew his mind was Patrick Reed playing in tournaments with iron lie angles that were off by 2 to 2.5 degrees. Reed apparently didn't notice this major equipment error for an extended period of time. Norman called this amazingly poor and used it as proof of broader institutional slackness in American professional golf. A player from Norman's era would have immediately spotted that something was wrong with their clubs. Reed's reliance on external fitters and equipment staff shows a detachment from the essential tools of the trade. Norman argues this kind of inconsistency contributes directly to problems he sees in the shorter game among top players today. In team match play, where crucial half points often depend on flawless execution inside 150 yards, these equipment failures can be absolutely fatal. The course set up at Bethpage Black creates another layer of difficulty that will test whether Norman's criticisms are accurate. Bethpage is known for being brutally hard with narrow tree-lined fairways that punish any errant shots. Norman's strategic principles emphasize that players need laser-like accuracy rather than just pure length. The course will quickly punish players who don't have complete control of their game. Norman specifically warns about proper club selection and monitoring shifting wind patterns. He points out that wind often intensifies on the back nine in the afternoon, which requires maintaining a light grip to keep rhythmic swing flow against headwinds. Given Bethpage's significant elevation changes, correct club choices become even more critical, especially when playing downhill shots. Players also need to be ready to capitalize on downwind holes to offset offset the stiff challenges from crosswind and headwind holes. The course modifications for the Ryder Cup reveal something interesting about priorities. Bethpage Black was originally designed by A.W. Tillinghast and Joseph Burbeck and is famous for its difficulty. Architect Rhys Jones made changes to prepare for this Ryder Cup spectacle. The setup of the opening hole shows a deliberate choice to prioritize maximum drama and spectator engagement over pure strategic golf. They built a massive grandstand structure behind the first tee, which required relocating the tee box forward and to the left. This changes the angle on the 397-yard par 4. Combined with typically downwind conditions, this setup creates a high-risk, high-reward scenario. Aggressive long hitters like Rory McIlroy or Bryson DeChambeau might attempt to drive directly over the trees to the front edge of the green, a carry of approximately 340 yards. This shot is fraught with risk, but the potential for an instant birdie or eagle provides the all-important strong start that generates a stadium-like roar. Now, we need to talk about the crowd factor because this might be the most defining element of the entire tournament. Norman predicts the contest will be fierce and significantly closer than the 16.5 to 11.5 loss Team USA suffered in Rome in 2023. He attributes this mainly to the boisterous New York crowds providing a huge home team advantage, but Norman has deep personal history with how aggressive New York golf fans can be. Back at the 1986 US Open at Shinnecock Hills, he was provoked enough to directly confront two hecklers in the gallery. After the incident, Norman said he hadn't experienced that kind of stuff anywhere else, and specifically noted that New York crowds open their mouths too much. This establishes a decades-long precedent of exceptional fan volatility in the New York area. It confirms that the 2025 event won't be a polite sporting occasion, but rather a confrontation where the crowd actively tries to exert competitive pressure. The post-tournament reactions from the 2025 event validated every concern about crowd behavior. Tom Watson, a former U.S. captain and American golf legend, felt compelled to issue a direct public apology for the behavior of the American crowd at Bethpage. He said he was ashamed of the rude and mean-spirited behavior he witnessed. This is extraordinary because a beloved American figure felt he had to apologize for his own country's fans at a home Ryder Cup. Ian Poulter, known for his Ryder Cup passion, launched a scathing verbal attack calling the crowd's heckling complete and utter embarrassing stupidity. He emphasized that this level of disruptive non-golf specific noise occurs only in America. The organizers even created and accommodated a beer pit at Bethpage, which signals they anticipated and were willing to manage an environment where high-spirited and potentially disruptive behavior was expected. Norman connects the crowd hostility directly to the larger institutional conflict in professional golf. He has repeatedly condemned what he calls the disgusting vitriol and hatred directed at LIV players, calling them the first movers who took all the abuse. Norman views the intense hostile atmosphere at Bethpage as just the most public and aggressive version of the toxic environment created by the golf civil war. For players who navigated the schism between traditional tours and LIV, the aggressive partisan cheering gets amplified by broader sentiment about institutional loyalty versus defection. Every match becomes a test of institutional allegiance as much as competitive skill. Norman is basically saying the crowd isn't just rooting for America, they're rooting against anyone who challenged the traditional golf establishment. Here's where the massive contradiction in Norman's position becomes impossible to ignore. He advocates strongly for sportsmanship and the humility of the game. He claims he approaches business and competition without emotion and points to how he congratulated opponents like Rory McIlroy on professional achievements. But this desire for decorum exists in direct tension with his actual history as the leader of golf's biggest disruption. Norman himself has been described as confrontational. His entire strategy in establishing LIV golf required directly challenging the sport's most cherished traditions and institutions. The poaching of Henrik Stenson perfectly demonstrates this. Stenson was named European Ryder Cup captain, but Norman convinced him to join LIV Golf. Stenson had to give up the captaincy, which created enormous controversy. This strategic maneuvering created the exact environment of structural discord and vitriol that Norman now criticizes. So Norman demands higher standards from players and fans while simultaneously promoting a fundamentally confrontational business model. Looking at Team USA's situation through Norman's framework reveals two critical warnings. First, there's structural instability and identity fragmentation. The American team has to confront its underlying lack of deep institutional identity. Norman attributes this to associations based on temporary affiliations like college ties or internal pods created just for tournament week. Relying exclusively on the motivational effect of a boisterous home crowd cannot sustain a championship effort when underlying issues aren't addressed. If technical consistency problems like the Patrick Reed equipment situation aren't fixed, the structural integrity of the U.S. team remains inherently weaker than the tour-derived cohesion of the European side. Second, there's the pressure cooker environment itself. Bethpage Black's architecture modified for maximum spectacle creates a hostile, high-pressure competitive situation. This atmosphere, combined with the proven tendency of New York crowds to move beyond support into overt hostility, guarantees the contest will be an unparalleled test of mental fortitude. The final result will depend significantly on which team maintains discipline and composure in this unique maelstrom. Despite all the criticism and controversy, there's actually something positive emerging from this mess. The LIV schism remains central to the 2025 Ryder Cup narrative, but prominent traditional figures are now calling for changes. Rory McIlroy, who was one of the most vocal critics of LIV golf, has actively advocated for policy changes to allow key LIV players like Jon Rahm to participate in the 2025 event. This is huge because it shows that even the staunchest defenders of traditional golf recognize the Ryder Cup's value transcends the institutional turf war. The pressure being placed on governing bodies to include LIV players confirms the event's competitive importance is bigger than anyone's business model. Norman's vision successfully created a schism that simultaneously threatened the Ryder Cup's integrity while highlighting its indispensable cultural value. The contest at Bethpage Black will serve as a pivotal competitive and cultural flashpoint in Ryder Cup history. It tests whether the team concept that Norman observed as so powerful yet so fragile in traditional golf can survive compounding pressures. An aggressive home crowd, a brutally difficult course, and a continuing professional schism all combine to create the ultimate test. For Norman, regardless of who wins, a close and intensely fought match validates his fundamental critique. He believes professional golf requires structural evolution to sustain the passion and team competition that global audiences demand. The tournament will show whether temporary patriotic fervor and home field advantage can overcome the lack of institutional identity Norman identified, or whether Europe's deeper cohesion built through shared professional pathways proves superior once again. What makes this tournament fascinating is how it forces everyone in golf to confront uncomfortable truths. The Americans have to face questions about whether their players care more about money than representing their country. The traditional tours have to acknowledge that Norman's disruptive model exposed real weaknesses in how they build player loyalty and team identity. The Europeans have to deal with their own cohesion challenges created by the split between players who stayed loyal to traditional tours and those who left for LIV. And Norman himself has to reconcile his stated desire for sportsmanship and humility with the confrontational approach that defined his leadership of the golf revolution. The architectural and strategic demands of the course add another dimension to this drama. Norman's principles about course management emphasize control and environmental awareness. Players must focus on shot making rather than pure length because Bethpage will punish errant shots immediately. The narrow tree-lined fairways require laser-like accuracy. The elevation changes demand perfect club selection. The shifting wind patterns, especially intensifying on the back nine in the afternoon, require technical adjustments that test whether players truly understand their equipment and their game. These are exactly the areas where Norman criticized modern players for lacking consistency and rigor. The toxic atmosphere that Norman both predicted and helped create will be a central storyline. The beer pit accommodation by organizers shows they expected fan behavior to be rowdy and potentially problematic. Tom Watson's apology confirms it exceeded acceptable bounds. Ian Poulter's scathing comments about American crowd stupidity prove the environment was uniquely hostile, even by international sports standards. Norman connects this directly to the broader institutional conflict, arguing the vitriol directed at LIV players created the toxic culture that manifested in crowd behavior. But again, the contradiction is glaring. Norman led the disruption that created the division, then complains about the negative atmosphere that resulted from it. The financial compensation debate adds yet another layer of complexity to Team USA's identity crisis. When Patrick Cantlay and other American players demanded payment for Ryder Cup participation, it revealed a fundamentally transactional relationship with the event. European players traditionally viewed participation as an honor and contributed financially back to their tour. This cultural difference in how players value representing their team versus maximizing personal income validates Norman's structural critique. American professional golf's model centered on individual celebrity and massive wealth accumulation creates erosion of institutional respect. His LIV model with explicit and immediate financial incentives attempted to bypass this ethical debate entirely by just paying players so much that loyalty became guaranteed through contracts rather than cultivated through shared institutional experience. The ultimate irony is that Norman, despite being confrontational and divisive, might actually be right about professional golf needing structural evolution. His observation that the powerful team concept existed only during Ryder Cup week and was totally missing the rest of the year identified a real gap. Traditional tours did struggle to create the kind of team loyalty and identity that manifested so powerfully at the Ryder Cup. LIV Golf's attempt to fill that gap with guaranteed team structures and multi-year commitments was a legitimate response to a legitimate problem, even if the execution was messy and the Saudi funding was controversial. The fact that figures like Rory McIlroy now advocate for including LIV players in the Ryder Cup shows traditional golf is adapting and recognizing it can't just ignore the changes Norman forced on the sport. So make sure you're subscribed to this channel because the 2025 Ryder Cup is going to be absolutely wild. Comment below and let us know if you think Team USA can overcome the structural structural weaknesses Norman identified, or if Europe's deeper institutional cohesion will prevail again. This tournament is way bigger than just golf. It's about competing visions for how professional sports should work, about loyalty versus money, about tradition versus disruption, and about whether passionate crowds can carry a team that lacks genuine institutional identity. Bethpage Black will answer these questions in the most intense and hostile environment the Ryder Cup has ever seen. Whatever happens, Norman's critique that professional golf needed to evolve will be tested like never before.